Welcome to the She Said Privacy, He Said Security podcast. Like any good marriage, we will debate, evaluate, and sometimes quarrel about how privacy and security impact business in the 21st century.
Hi, Jody Daniels here. I'm the founder and CEO of Red Clover Advisors, a certified women's privacy consultancy. I'm a privacy consultant and certified informational privacy professional, providing practical privacy advice to overwhelmed companies.
Hi, Justin Daniels here. I am passionate about helping companies solve complex cyber and privacy challenges during the life cycle of their business. I am the cyber quarterback, helping clients design and implement cyber plans, as well as help them manage and recover from data breaches.
And this episode is brought to you by, oh, look at me, I'm a symbol now. Red Clover Advisors. We help companies to comply with data privacy laws and establish customer trust so that they can grow and nurture integrity. We work with companies in a variety of fields, including technology, e-commerce, media, and professional services. In short, we use data privacy to transform the way companies do business. Together, we're creating a future where there's greater trust between companies and consumers. To learn more, visit redcloveradvisors.com. And today we're going to talk about a really fun topic.
How you're going to transform your office with a new picture?
That was not the planned topic. But maybe the next time that we have one of these, well, probably not the next time, but in the future, one of these on YouTube, you'll be able to see hopefully a beautiful new picture opposed to the boring blue wall.
All righty then. Okay, so today we are going to take off and talk about privacy and drones.
Oh, look at you being all cutesy clever.
Well, have my moments, as few as they may be. So we have with us today Mark McKinnon, partner at Fox Rothschild, and he has nearly 3 decades of experience in aviation and transportation law, including litigation, appellate, regulatory, and administrative matters. He is particularly well-versed in unmanned aircraft systems law, assisting clients in their efforts to obtain approval for complex commercial UAS operations, including beyond visual line of sight and autonomous flight. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Justin's so excited because we're talking about one of his favorite topics, drones. But before we do that, Mark, we always like to understand how people's career evolves. So the drones that we have flying today, as Basil the dog would like to agree, we didn't really have those quite the way we do now when you started your career. So help us understand a little bit of your career progression.
Yeah, so I actually started my career. I actually clerked for a judge in the Sixth Circuit. And then after that, I decided I would move to Washington, D.C. and go into private practice. And it just so happened that there was a noted lawyer who was the head of the civil division, particularly the aviation division, who had just left the Justice Department and had started an aviation practice. And he was looking for lawyers. And I had no aviation background at all. And I sent in my resume, and he hired me. And I thought, well, I'll do this for a while, and then I'll see what comes up in a couple of years. And 32 years later, I'm still working with the same team of people. We're doing the same types of aviation law. It's just one of those things, you just kind of stumble into it, and then you keep doing it. But you're right, when we started, the practice was almost completely focused on mass aviation disasters. So, we worked on all of the big, airplane crashes in the 90s and the 2000s, the TWA 800, US Air 427, US Air 1016, Alaska 261, the 9/11 litigation, all that stuff. And over the decades, fortunately, the increase in things like SMS and other types of safety protocols have caused aviation to be just amazingly safe. I mean, people forget, in the 90s, you would have 1 or 2 major U.S. air crashes every year. And, and I think today, if a major airliner were to crash, there hasn't been a major one in a long time. It would be shocking to people because that's how safe aviation is. But as a result of that, then, the practice, which was always an aviation industry practice, kind of changed. And, we got into more regulatory enforcement and compliance issues, air carrier regulation, that kind of stuff. And then once drones really started to take off in around 2012, when we started to get some of the legal framework that allowed drones to fly, I started getting into that, and that just kind of developed into a specialty, that I do now. So it's just an offshoot of the fact that we have a broad aviation practice.
Well, Justin and I were knocking on wood because as you were talking, I was thinking about, you're right. We have been fortunate to realize how safe aviation is right now, and that is a good thing. So we're continuing to knock on our wood for all planes flying everywhere.
Remember, Mark, just as initial question, the FAA, they regulate privacy and security, right?
Yes. Oh, deeply, yes. No, it's funny because I don't know if you were following it. When the small UAS, the small drone rule was coming out, there was a group called EPIC, which actually asked the FAA to do a rulemaking specifically about drones and privacy. And they came back and said, under no circumstances will we do that. Their position was, while we regulate aviation, it is purely aviation safety. We have no interest in anything that's not safety related, and that while there's broad federal preemption, states are not allowed to regulate almost anything having to do with drones, airspace, where they can fly, the requirements for pilots. The FAA has said, the states can knock themselves out when it comes to privacy issues, just so long as they don't use it as like a stealth way of getting into, to control the airspace. So for example, like, the FAA has said that a state can pass limits on how video shot from a drone is used, whether it's if you shoot somebody in their backyard and the state has a law that says you can't do it, that's fine. But what the state can't do is turn around and say, okay, well, now no drones can fly in our state below 300 feet, because that's actually an airspace regulation and not a privacy regulation. So there's kind of a split there.
So, Mark, you've just teed us up for the first thing we wanted to talk about, and that is the recent Michigan drone case. And would love for you to give our audience a little bit of the background and why that is an interesting case when it comes to rights of privacy and drones and law enforcement.
Yeah, it's actually been percolating through the system for a while now. The original decision came out from the Court of Appeals last year, and then the Supreme Court of Michigan decided to take it up. And then recently, they've actually sent it back to the Court of Appeals for them to look at an issue not related to the privacy part of it, but over an issue about whether or not, because the case involves Long Lake Township and their use of an administrative warrant to try and photograph someone's property, or to do what they should have had an administrative warrant and they didn't have one. The question was, was that a warrantless search proper or not? So they sent it back to look at that question about whether in a non-criminal context, there is the Fourth Amendment protects against that. But the core ruling about privacy actually really is undisturbed. And I think, it highlights something that's really been percolating when we're talking about drones and privacy. So the case involved, Long Lake Township was involved with a dispute over a guy, and he had a big property in the township, and he had a junkyard there, basically, his own private junkyard. And the township declared it a nuisance, and there was a lot of litigating back and forth, and they entered into a consent decree. They said, okay, well, you don't have to take everything off your property, but you can't keep adding to it. And he agreed to that. And after a couple of years, the township was like, we think, this guy is violating the rule. We think he's bringing stuff in there and it's growing, but it's in a place where we can't see it because it's a large property. So they hired a drone company to, over a period of several months, surveil this guy's property and then do some photo analysis to determine, is this pile of junk growing, or is it shrinking, or is it the same? And they basically found that no, it was definitely growing. The guy was adding stuff. They went and started an action because he was violating the consent decree. And the guy came into court and said, well, wait a minute. The only evidence you've got is this aerial surveillance video. And it's an illegal search and seizure. And it has to be excluded. And then without that, you have no evidence. And the district court looked at that and said, well, no, because, and this is the thing, when we're talking about aviation, the Supreme Court, when they've looked at questions about your reasonable expectation of privacy from people flying airplanes and photographing your property, has basically drawn the lines of, if the flight is legal, then you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy. And the fact that the airplane is flying over your property and recording it, because they're kind of in that the mode where you have the trespass, and if it's something that's viewable on your property, from a place where a person has a legal right to see, then you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy. So that's kind of the way the courts have been looking at it. I went to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals completely, disregarded all of this existing case law. And it was kind of interesting the way they did it. Because so going back 1986, the Supreme Court was looking at these first cases where it was they were using airplanes for drug enforcement, particularly in places like California and Arizona. And they're flying over these big properties looking for marijuana that's grown illegally. And in 86, the Supreme Court said, if a fixed-wing airplane is flying at 1,000 feet and they're photographing your property, and they're there specifically to photograph your property, you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy that comes in. And then 3 years later, the Supreme Court had a case involving a helicopter, and a helicopter was flying at 400 feet. Well, the airspace rules are different. Fixed-wing aircraft generally has to stay at 1,000 feet or higher. Helicopters can fly at lower altitudes under certain circumstances. The helicopter was legal where it was. They said, you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy if the evidence comes in. So in this case, drones are different because when the FAA passed Part 107 regulations, which govern how you fly your drone, they carved out a part of the airspace which manned aircraft normally cannot use, and said all drones have to fly in this airspace, and it's between the ground and 400 feet. So for drones, the navigable airspace is actually, this entire airspace which fixed-wing aircraft don't normally operate in. And the Court of Appeals looked at these issues and said, well, we recognize that if we were going to strictly follow what the Supreme Court said, this would be legal because a drone flying at 200 feet has every right to be there, and it's really no different. It's smaller. Maybe the camera isn't quite as good. Maybe it's better, but that would normally be legal. And when they were looking at it, they kind of looked at this whole issue of how technology changes, and people's expectations of privacy shouldn't necessarily change as the technology improves. And one of the things they said is, and this is it's a quote, that low altitude, unmanned, specifically targeted drone surveillance of a private individual's property is qualitatively different from the kinds of human-operated aircraft overflights that the Supreme Court permits. And so as a result, they said drone surveillance of this nature intrudes into persons' reasonable expectations of privacy. And then they talked about the fact that drones, because they're smaller, they're stealthier. If a helicopter is 200 feet over your house, you know it's there. If a drone's 200 feet over your house, maybe you don't really know it's there. So, and they said that all of those things combined means that they were going to abandon that approach about what you have as a reasonable expectation of privacy when you're dealing with aerial photography. And I think the interesting part about that is that the court recognized that they were kind of on a slippery slope, and because they in the past, the way the FAA has looked at it, because you have this altitude test, if the flight is legal, it's legal, and you can surveil. If we're going to say that at some point, you have a right of privacy over some altitude of your property, where do we draw that line? Where is the altitude going to be drawn? The Court of Appeals said, well, we're not going to do that because that would be arbitrary and futile. And so they just said that, they would kind of leave it as almost this kind of loosey-goosey standard where it's like, we don't know at what point it's going to cross the threshold, but it's, what is it that statement the Supreme Court just says about pornography? I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. Well, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, I can't define when your privacy is violated, but we'll know it when we see it. And so as a result, for drone companies, it really puts them, if this is going to be the standard to determine where you have a reasonable expectation of privacy for purposes of, because when we're talking about reasonable expectation of privacy, it's not just, well, this is a warrant case and a search case. The same principles are involved in common law suits for invasion of privacy. Do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy if somebody's flying a drone over your house and photographing your backyard or photographing your property or photographing you back there? And so, if this is going to be the way that the courts are going to look at it, it really causes a headache trying to come up with a policy and a data management solution and permissions. And, it's just, so I think it's really interesting. This is the first case of its type, which has really kind of looked at aviation and aerial photography differently.
So, Mark, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question. So you're probably aware of the flights that Flytrex does, what they're doing with Walgreens down in Fort Worth, Texas. So what are the implications with a decision like this if you want to have last mile delivery and they want to fly over your house, my house, to get to somebody's landing pad for their prescription. And if those cameras are on, they could be looking into my backyard and your backyard. So it seems to me that would be a really interesting question that has to be solved when you look at personal privacy versus this entire commercial industry around drone delivery that's sprouting up pretty quick.
Right, and that's the thing. I think a lot of people were looking at this, over the past years as of, well, we have a right, if our cameras are filming and we have a right to fly over this route, that we have a right then to have this data and to collect it and to manage it as part of our business. And I think what this shows is you can't necessarily treat that data as just open availability, public domain data. That you have to kind of treat it like you would other people's information, and make sure that you're not disseminating it, that you're not publicizing it, or making it available to the public. And maybe again, if you are doing you're doing a drone flight video, you better be careful about what's in the lower left-hand corner of your video showing your delivery, when you're advertising it, because you may catch something in your video that somebody had a reasonable expectation of privacy in, and now they're embarrassed. And so I think that's the primary implication is, you have to treat this type of data now, as something that you can't just throw around and make available to people.
So you two kind of joked that the FAA does not cover privacy. Who is managing privacy? If we think about the different laws that are out there now, we could talk about the current California law, the 4+ California's upgrade that are coming next year, maybe even the new federal privacy law. What of any of those privacy laws, how do they intersect with drones?
Well, because the way the FAA, has taken the approach they've taken with it, that is a problem, particularly if you're you're trying to develop a nationwide network, you're caught up in the patchwork, just like everybody else, of state regulation. And, you get all these issues then about, what privacy laws are going to govern. Is it the place where I filmed? Is it the place, where the flight was? Is it the place where I'm storing my data? Is it the place where, my company is headquartered? The choice of law questions, then proliferate, and, trying to square that circle of, coming up with a comprehensive privacy regime that's going to protect you on a nationwide basis becomes really, really difficult. And, I think, it's one of those things at the federal level, there's the, what was it? Whose it is it? They have that, they was back maybe 4 or 5 years ago, was the federal best practices. I forget which group promulgated. It was OIRA or one of the other groups. But anyway, so, that apart from just like trying to pick up at the federal level, what the federal best practices definitions are, you're pretty much, stuck at the state level when you're trying to figure out how to manage your data.
So I'm just curious if we have in some of these laws consideration that video could be sensitive data, and if drones collect video data, and if sensitive data and some of those needs to be opt-in consent to be able to use that, and I have a drone flying over a bunch of properties who didn't get consent to do that, it feels like you'd have a major conflict of two different laws, and even federal agencies intersecting there. Well, I guess not intersecting really well. In other words, how do those things align where I have this movement to video data as being considered sensitive and I might need to have opt-in consent, but I have a drone flying over that says I can have any airspace from the ground up to 400 feet without consent?
Right, and I think a lot of it then depends on, how the drone is using the video data. Because generally, apart from, some drones that are using the cameras for navigational purposes, but the whole point is when they're doing that, they're generally not storing the data because you're collecting a large amount of data. And again, if you're running a nationwide program, just the storage of that incidentally collected data, you don't really want it unless you're going to use the data as part of like some research and development program, to improve your navigation. But a lot of times when that kind of work is being done, it's being done at a test range or one of these test sites or as part of a pilot program where it's more defined. It's not generally, you're just flying over everybody's house and then you're collecting the data and you're storing it. So I think that's probably, where the drone industry, it doesn't get caught up with that on its daily operations, but it does come into play. If I'm a real estate agent and I'm, filming a video of this house that I'm going to sell and I want to use it online, then depending on where you are, you got to consider like, well, what else is in the frame? What else is in the video? Do I have to get other people's permission? How do I film this video so I'm only getting the video that I want, that I don't need other people's permission for? So I think that's the other place where, where the industry has this kind of issue.
That's interesting, Mark, because I'm dealing with some camera issues now because cameras are proliferating across the country for purposes of public safety. So you put them in the right of way where there's less of an expectation of privacy. Now, if there's a car wreck, you're going to have every personal injury lawyer calling up wanting camera feeds because that could help or hinder a case. So I guess, how would that apply to drones? I guess it would be the case that if it's a private company, that's their data. But if it were for law enforcement or something else that is collecting data, I guess that would also be another wrinkle to our patchwork privacy challenge we have in this country.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, you see that, just recently there was the story about how, one of the doorbell companies, I forget whether it was the Google product or the Amazon product, there was a disclosure that they were routinely turning over video without the owners, the homeowners' permission to law enforcement. If law enforcement represented that there was an ongoing emergency, they would just turn the video data over without disclosing it. So yeah, I mean, obviously that kind of thing, if you have a drone and people know you were flying, you're going to be subject to a subpoena or discovery or something, depending on what the data is and who wants it.
In just this overall theme of federal and state privacy laws, let's switch a little bit from just our drone fun to what is happening in the privacy space, which is the introduction of a federal privacy law that would preempt the various state patchworks that we have. So, Mark, I am just curious for your thoughts on, everyone's asking the crystal ball question. How likely is this federal law actually going to be? What is your opinion?
Well, again, it's that whole Charlie Brown and Lucy with the football thing. It's like every once in a while you feel you're getting close and then it's snatched away at the last second and you fall on your face. But I think it's probably closer than it's ever been, but, until it happens, it doesn't happen. And, it's an election year and there's a lot going on. I know that, for example, just today, there was another movement. The president was announcing the Build Back Better version 3. I've forgotten what they're calling it now, but Manchin had kind of given in. And so now they're going to be talking about another tax and stimulus bill, that's going to, be making its way through the Congress and through the Senate. And that's going to suck all the air out of the room, in the short term. And then again, people like to go and campaign, and it would seem to me it's more likely to happen in the lame duck part of the session, depending on how the outcome of the election is, and not necessarily something that will happen before the election. But you never know. I mean, maybe people will be desperate to show some kind of progress, and we can all get along, and we can all get something done. It came out of the committee with it was a pretty bipartisan vote. What was it, last week? So, that bodes well, at least in the House, of it getting through. I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
Agreed.
And Mark, if you have any really good prognostications about tonight's Powerball number, they'll be greatly appreciated. Just PM me and not our audience.
I do, and I've already bought a ticket, so you can't.
Okay, fair enough. Good point. So, kind of talking a little bit more about drones and the FAA, I guess one thing I have as a question for you, given your long experience, is, and I got my Part 107, so I learned firsthand how seriously the FAA takes safety, is could you see regulation by the FAA for privacy and probably more likely security, because security is a straight line to safety. Privacy, it's a little bit hazy, but a lot of the breach notification laws are keyed off of the kind of data that gets breached. So I just didn't know if you had any kind of background for our audience as to why the FAA has been reluctant to get into these areas, and are you seeing things that might make you think it'll change, or no, that's really going to be the purview of a federal law or this continued state patchwork?
I think as far as the FAA is concerned, that they do not feel that they have the expertise in that area, and they want to stay as far away from it as possible. With regard to security, though, I think you're right. That is different, and to a certain extent, it is taken into account somewhat for the more advanced drone operations, because if you're going to fly beyond visual line of sight, eventually when those regulations come, you're going to need a certificated aircraft, which means it's going to have to go through an FAA design approval, and that it's going to have to be manufactured according to those specifications. And things like the security of comm links and cybersecurity, those are all actually part of the certification process. So those will be considered. Now, when we're talking about small drones that are operated within visual line of sight, I don't think there'll be much change, because the FAA said they want to stay away from mandatory design issues. I think it would take an incident where somebody basically took control of a drone and then used it for nefarious purposes before people would take that seriously enough to say, well, the FAA needs to regulate it and we need to have some kind of encryption standards, beyond just what the industry is providing on its own.
So, Mark, as a follow-up question to you, and again, I'm asking for Mark's crystal ball, is how long do you think it'll be before we start seeing drone flights regularly over our neighborhoods or more densely urban areas? Do you think that's 5, 10, 15 years out? Because obviously we have to have what's called UAS traffic management. Think of air traffic control towers for all these drones buzzing around at 400 feet. I mean, there's a lot involved to really make this safe and workable from an FAA perspective.
I think probably, I would say 5 or maybe a little less than 5, right in there. That might be the sweet spot, because right now, I mean, the big holdup, as you mentioned, is the unmanned traffic management, and then also just the protocols and the regulations for beyond visual line of sight flight, where you're going to have a highly automated aircraft, that's really going to be traversing areas. And the FAA concluded a aviation rulemaking committee. They made recommendations not that long ago, and right now they're working on the regulations. I would expect to see draft regulations on that probably right around the end of the year, and then there'll be a notice and comment period, and then maybe a final regulation a year after that, and then beyond that, then it'll be like a slow implementation process and getting these other systems in place. So yeah, 5 years is probably about right.
Because I guess, Mark, one thing I wanted to ask you about is when I read about what they're doing down in Fort Worth with Walgreens and some of these other drone operations, getting a waiver from the FAA to fly beyond visual line of sight is exceedingly difficult. When they're doing that 5-mile delivery, are they literally having people stand around at different mile intervals to watch that drone? Because, as a pilot, you can only see it for so far. I was just curious.
It depends. It depends on where, because a lot of these are done as these pilot programs, and some of them have progressed to the point where it's just done autonomously without an extended line of sight, where you have a visual observer every mile and a half who does that see and avoid. There's still a lot of companies that are doing that, but some of the big players, they have progressed to pilot programs which are now like truly beyond visual line of sight. So,
for companies creating privacy programs, whether that's a drone company, a company using a drone, what are some of the missteps that you see? What are companies not doing that they should be?
Well, I think one of the big missteps, again, is really, well, I mean, a lot of drone companies are relatively small companies. And I'm talking about obviously like a UPS or a Google Wing, they have, armies of lawyers who consider all these things. But, if I'm just, a guy who does, contracts to do aerial surveillance for anybody who'll hire me, construction companies, power line, inspections, things like that. They don't really, it's like number 20 on the list of 18 things that they need to do. So a lot of times it just doesn't get addressed. And I think, apart from the part that, the person who's contracting with them, they obviously like, well, this is my data. You're collecting this data for me. This is what I want you to do with it. Those things they tend to be up on. But the more general things about, am I collecting data when I'm flying around that isn't just the customer's data, that there might be privacy implications for? Or are there different privacy rules depending on, like, I'm here today in this county and I'm because you can get, differences in rules even at the county or town level, in some states. Those things, again, I think it's just the not being aware that there are potentially issues that you should consider. That would be the main thing.
Awareness is critical. Can't
Mhm.
do anything if you don't know what you're supposed to be doing.
But I think Mark also makes a really good point that we've learned, Jody, is the drone industry has a few large players, but otherwise is pretty highly fragmented. So smaller companies, as we've learned, privacy and security tend to be afterthoughts. And once they have a problem, if they've grown big enough, oh, well, then we'll deal with it then. Mark, has that been a similar experience in your practice?
I think you see that a lot. I mean, it's like it's basically, it's not even just drones. It's any industry that has a lot of startups. That's obviously the focus on the business is getting up and running, and then trying to make a name for yourself and be a success. And a lot of these other things. You're right. It's just, when we get successful, God willing, then we'll have the time and the opportunity to do it. But unfortunately, a lot of times it's like, once you're up and running, it's like, okay, now we're finally making it. It's like, well, I don't really have time now because now it's a success, and now I got to figure out how to expand and get more employees, and that time never really seems to come.
There's never enough time.
Until you have a data breach or a ransomware event. And then you learn the hard way. It's funny how, Mark, technology may change, but human nature is remarkably consistent.
Yeah.
But anyway, we always like to ask all of our guests, do you have a favorite privacy tip or security tip you'd like to share with the audience?
I think again, I think one of the best things to do, particularly for a small company, is actually the follow the old do unto others. Like whenever you're considering what you're doing with people's data, probably the best rule of thumb is if somebody's doing that with my data, would it make me angry enough that I would do something about it? And so, if you're doing something that would make you queasy about somebody else doing it, maybe you shouldn't be doing it. And that's why I think probably the first gut check. Then before you then look at, what's legal and what's not legal, what am I gonna, how likely is somebody to sue me? You should always start with that. It's like, well, am I really at the end of the day doing something that, people would question what I'm doing? And then I think the other main thing is, be transparent, when you're dealing with customers and things like that. If you have an idea what you're doing with their data, it's probably best to disclose it. And then maybe the last thing is, again, legal requirements are really our minimum standards. And so you shouldn't always just figure out, well, this is what the law requires, and I'm not going to do anything more. Again, in the aviation industry, you'll never see any airline saying we meet all FAA minimum requirements for safety. That's not how you operate. And so I think, you should probably take that view into other areas of your business as well.
That is incredibly well said. I absolutely love that. It might be borrowing it. So, Mark, when you're not working in the aviation space and studying what is happening with drones, what do you like to do for fun?
Actually, the primary thing I do is a lot of bike riding. I lived in Bethesda, Maryland, and I had my office in Tysons Corner, Virginia. And you could take the metro, and it would take an hour and a half to get there. Or I could ride my bike and it would take an hour and 10 minutes. So as a result, rain or shine, winter and summer, I rode my bike, 2.5 hours every day back and forth to work. And it's I really enjoyed doing it. And so now I don't do the bicycle commuting as much anymore, but I just try and keep it up on the weekends because I just, I really enjoy doing it. It's just kind of mindless, and you go out there and just kind of cruise along the road. But that's probably it.
Hopefully cars are nice to you.
Yeah, well, that was the thing. Riding home in the winter in Virginia was a challenge because it's dark, and no matter how well lit you are, you can see. It's weird. If somebody's coming at you, you can see their eyes, and you can tell sometimes where they're looking at you, but they don't see you. Because for whatever reason, mentally, their brain isn't making the connection. Your eyes are on you, but you can see they're just not processing the fact that you're there. So that's always a very scary moment.
That is. If you come to Atlanta, I recommend not biking. We're not very pedestrian or biking friendly roads here. We prefer trails. Mark, how can people find you and get connected?
The best way is, again, if you go to Fox Rothschild, Rothschild. My contact information is all on the website. And in addition, we have a blog. It's Plainly Spoken blog. It's PLANELY spoken blog. And we cover aviation issues, drone issues, and things like that on the blog. So that's always a good place to find.
Very clever name. I love it. Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a really enlightening and fascinating discussion.
That was great.
And your favorite topic.
Yay.
It's always a good day when we talk about drones. But thank you again, Mark. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the She Said Privacy, He Said Security podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes and check us out on LinkedIn. See you next time.